Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. Have you ever looked at a piece of art so intensely personal that you feel like you're intruding, yet so mathematically precise that it feels like a scientific study of light and water?
It is. It's an incredibly rare combination to actually pull off. Usually when we look at the trajectory of modern art, we expect a piece to lean heavily one way or the other.
Right.
Like either it's this raw, emotional diary entry, just all passion and chaos, or it's a cold, calculated technical exercise that feels, well, almost clinical.
Exactly. And navigating that exact tension is what we are exploring today through a really fascinating article from The Economist. It's titled, David Hockney Believed in Working from the Heart. And we've also got some supplementary background notes on his life and legacy to draw from.
Yeah, and we are looking closely at one of the most famous, just instantly recognizable images of the 20th century. I'm talking about David Hockney's portrait of an artist, Pool with Two Figures.
So for those of you listening right now who might not have the image pulled up in front of you, picture this massive canvas. It is 10 feet wide.
Massive.
Yeah, it's essentially this glowing, life-sized window into a sun-drenched, incredibly still world. On the edge of a pristine swimming pool stands a slim man in a peachy pink jacket, looking down. And swimming underwater toward him is another young man in these modest white trunks.
In framing those two figures are these cascading, overlapping triangles of hills. They're painted in, cerulean blue, olive, sage, lime.
The colors are just incredible.
They really are. The colors are so intensely saturated, but, and this is the kicker, there is a distinct, heavy psychological weight to the scene. Even with all that bright California sunlight, you can just feel this profound emotional distance between the two figures.
You really can. You feel the silence of it. Now, the article we're looking at frames this painting, and really Hockney's work in general, as an expression of pure, almost overwhelming emotion. Hence the title, Working from the Heart. But I want to challenge that premise right out of the gate. Okay, let's unpack this. Is Hockney's story actually just about a romantic, tortured artist channeling his raw feelings onto a canvas? Or is it really a story of ruthless technical obsession, constant mechanical reinvention, and a complete refusal to be put into any of society's neat little boxes?
That is the essential question to ask when looking at this specific period of his life. To give you the context of that 1972 pool painting, the emotional reality was undeniably bleak.
It was a tough time.
Very. Hockney had just gone through a devastating breakup. That man, standing by the edge of the pool in the peachy pink jacket, that was his lover, Peter Schlesinger, and Peter had just left him for a young, tall, blonde Swede.
Ouch.
Yeah. Hockney was completely shattered. The article notes that the only person he could even bear to have around him in the studio during this time was his mother.
Wow, his mom.
Yeah, she was his absolute staunchest ally.
Right, so on the surface, the narrative of the, tortured artist pouring his heartbreak into the paint fits perfectly.
Okay.
He's hurting, so he paints to heal. But the actual execution of this painting, the physical reality of how he got the image onto the canvas, tells a completely different story.
It really does.
The labor involved was staggering. He was painting 18 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Just relentless.
And just 4 weeks before his new show was supposed to open in New York, he realized something was fundamentally wrong with the composition.
So what does he do?
He scraps the whole thing.
He just throws it out.
Literally starts over. He completely reorients the angle of the swimming pool and starts from scratch, finishing the night before the shipping crates arrive.
What's fascinating here is the sheer mechanics of that process. The Economist text notes he was working from the heart, but then it sort of casually lists all the techniques he employed to actually create the final image. And those techniques are intensely analytical. He used physical props, he used photographs, he played with these complex geometric perspectives. He literally physically paced out measurements in his studio.
Wait, let me stop you right there because this is exactly what I'm struggling with. If he is so overwhelmed by emotion and heartbreak, why is he pacing out measurements on the floor? How does measuring the floor solve an emotional problem on the canvas?
Well, because he wasn't trying to solve an emotional problem, he was trying to solve an optical one.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, pacing out the measurements wasn't about his feelings, it was about the mechanics of human vision. He needed to map the exact perspective of a person looking downward into a body of water.
Because water distorts things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Water refracts light. It bends shapes. If the geometry of the tiles beneath the water isn't mathematically perfect, the illusion of the pool just completely breaks. So he had his assistants stand in specific spots, he took hundreds of Polaroid photographs, and he analyzed exactly how the light hit them.
Hundreds of Polaroids.
Hundreds. He had to understand the physics of the scene before he could paint the emotion of it. That is not the behavior of someone simply riding a wave of despair, you know? That is the behavior of an engineer solving a structural failure.
That makes so much sense. It is like calling an architect a poet, because the building they designed is visually beautiful while completely ignoring the incredibly complex math, physics, and load-bearing equations required to keep the roof from caving in on you.
That's a great way to put it.
The emotion is the outcome, but the mathematics is the method. And it's not just this one painting either. Look at his other famous work, A Bigger Splash. The article mentions that it took him 2 entire weeks just to paint the flying droplets and the broken surface of the water.
2 weeks on a splash that in reality lasts for a fraction of a second. Just think about the intense concentration required to freeze time like that.
Exactly. It's like he is looking at a splash of water the way a software coder looks at a complex website. He wants to see the source code. He wants to see the underlying geometry of the light, the exact trajectory of every single droplet, so he can reverse engineer the water and rebuild it from scratch with paint.
Which perfectly illustrates why he felt such a deep kinship with Picasso. Hockney loved to quote Picasso's line, I'm not painting, I'm exploring.
I love that quote.
Right, because when you spend 2 weeks analyzing how light refracts through a single droplet of water, you are investigating reality. You are dismantling the visual world to figure out how it ticks. And that relentless investigative drive resulted in a masterpiece.
And a very valuable one at that.
Oh, absolutely. Just to put a number on how much that mastery resonates, the last time Portrait of an Artist changed hands in 2018, it sold for the highest auction price ever recorded for a living artist.
Unbelievable. So if he is this explorer, this, visual engineer, we really have to ask, where did that relentless mechanical drive actually come from?
That's the big question.
Because the easy answer, and the one that gets romanticized all the time in art history, is that it came from California. The article talks about him flying into Los Angeles at 26 years old, escaping gray post-war England, and just being utterly mesmerized by the little blue oblongs of swimming pools dotting the city.
The California dream.
Right. But I would argue his real artistic foundation wasn't built in the glamorous sunshine of L.A. It was built in Bradford, in working-class West Yorkshire.
Absolutely. The California sunshine provided the subject matter, sure, but the Yorkshire grit was the engine that made it all work. If we connect this to the bigger picture of his childhood, you see exactly where his resourceful mindset originated. His father, Ken Hockney, was a massive influence.
Ken was a fascinating guy.
He really was. The text described how Ken would constantly find old, broken bicycles or just, discarded pieces of domestic machinery. He'd strip them down to their core parts, paint them bright colors, and sell them as new.
And think about how that translates to his art mechanics. Ken was teaching him that materials aren't precious. They are functional. You break things down to their components to understand how they work, and then you rebuild them to serve your purpose.
Exactly.
Think about the post-war environment there, too. Money was tight. Resources were incredibly scarce. Hockney literally wheeled his paints and brushes around the streets of Bradford in a cast-off baby pram that his dad had repaired for him.
It was a completely pragmatic, unpretentious approach to the world, and his dedication to observation was just intense from a very young age.
Oh, yeah.
Well, at just 18 years old, he made his first trip to London. He didn't have money for a hotel room, so he just dossed on the tube, sleeping on the subway trains overnight until the museums opened in the morning. And then he hitchhiked all the way back to Yorkshire.
That is dedication.
He later said he saw more art that day than he had ever seen in his entire life.
Wow. And that resourceful mindset he built on the streets of Bradford, it didn't disappear when he finally reached the elite halls of the Royal College of Art in London. In fact, it became his ultimate weapon.
Oh, for sure.
For his first major work there, he didn't try to be avant-garde. He drew a half-size human skeleton. And he did it with such a profound understanding of perspective and anatomy that a fellow student, a former GI named R.B. Cottage, who actually became a major painter himself, offered him £5 for it.
Which is about £100 today.
Right.
That £5 skeleton sketch is such a crucial moment in his trajectory. It proved he had mastered the fundamental traditional skills of draftsmanship.
Wait, hold on, though. Let me push back on that. Drawing an anatomical skeleton sounds like, I don't know, high school biology homework. How does a basic pencil sketch of some bones prove he is ready to upend the modern art world?
Because you cannot intentionally break the rules until you completely understand them.
Uh,
Yeah, understanding bone structure, like how a joint hinges, how a rib cage creates volume and space, that allows you to later distort the human form intentionally for emotional effect, rather than just accidentally distorting it because you don't know how to draw.
right, it's a choice.
Exactly. It gave him absolute technical authority. So when the article talks about him eventually going to America, dyeing his hair blonde, getting those iconic thick-framed glasses, and experimenting with new materials like acrylics, it frames it as this grand liberation, but he was already liberated.
Right. I think we dramatically over-romanticize that California transformation.
Right.
It wasn't a personality transplant. It's more like an incredible indie film director who has been shooting gritty, brilliant movies on cheap black and white film stock, suddenly being handed a massive studio budget for Technicolor.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
The vision, the resourcefulness, the obsession with stripping things down and rebuilding them. That was already fully formed in Yorkshire. America just finally gave him the budget, the light, and the space to blow it up to 10 feet wide.
And that deeply ingrained independence was vital, because when he was at the Royal College of Art, the art establishment was fiercely dictating the rules of what was considered, good or important art. The text notes that abstract expressionism and conceptual art were the absolute in things.
For our listeners who might not be deep into art history, abstract expressionism was the movement dominated by artists like Jackson Pollock. So the idea of moving away from reality and just throwing pure emotion, shapes, and splatters onto a canvas.
Right.
And conceptual art took it even further, arguing that the idea behind the art was more important than the physical execution of it.
Exactly. So painting recognizable, realistic figures was seen by the critics as hopelessly outdated, but Hockney completely rejected that pressure. He insisted on figurative painting because he wanted to capture his actual lived reality.
He wasn't interested in just shapes.
No, he wanted to paint his London life, his
Yeah.
friends, his passions. He was deeply inspired by the poetry of Constantine Cavafy and Walt Whitman, and he felt this intense, driving need to combine sex and love in his work. He was a young gay man finding his identity, and he absolutely refused to hide that reality behind safe, abstract splatters of paint.
But there is a danger in how we teach this part of his life today, I think. We often try to sanitize it. The supplementary background notes we have actually suggest a safe framing approach for educators or learners discussing Hockney's work.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they advise focusing on universal themes like perseverance and innovation while keeping sensitive topics neutral.
This raises an important question. If you strip away the specific radical nature of his queer double portraits in the 1960s and 70s, aren't you doing a massive disservice to the art itself?
Absolutely.
You can't just extract perseverance as an abstract concept and leave the historical context behind. His perseverance was his defiance.
Yes.
He was painting intimate, tender moments between men at a time when homosexuality had barely been decriminalized in the UK and was still heavily stigmatized everywhere else.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The Economist article makes this beautiful, subtle comparison. It points out that ever since the Renaissance, artists have painted bathers in nature. But traditionally, the bather was used as a metaphor for washing off stains and spiritual sin, a cleansing of impurity.
Right, a very religious motif.
Exactly. But Hockney takes that classic motif and completely flips the mechanics of it. He wasn't washing away sin at all. By placing modern men in these intimate, sun-drenched, vividly colorful settings of leisure, he was unapologetically normalizing his own reality.
That is so powerful.
There was no shame, no sin to wash off, just light, water, and human connection. He ignored the art world's rules and society's rules simultaneously.
It's a brilliant subversion of art history. He's taken the grand tradition of the Renaissance and using it to validate and elevate his immediate personal reality. And that lifelong refusal to be boxed in perfectly explains the latter half of his career.
How so?
Because once he conquered the painting of water, once he mastered the swimming pool, he didn't just stop and paint them for the rest of his life. He completely pivoted the very tools he used to create.
The relentless march forward. I mean, he goes from pastels and watercolors to creating these gigantic immersive murals of the Yorkshire trees he knew as a child. He even experimented with papier-mâché while working in upstate New York.
The papier-mâché phase is fascinating because it shows how deeply he thought about the physical properties of his mediums. He worked with a printer friend, using these mounds of wet, colored paper pulp.
Just wet mush, basically.
Exactly. He would corral these pulpy mounds into different shapes, squeeze them between massive presses under immense pressure, and print them on huge sheets of wet paper.
But okay, why wet paper pulp? Why not just use oil paint to capture a pool? What does mashing paper in a press actually achieve mechanically?
Because squeezing wet paper pulp under massive pressure actually fuses the color into the material itself.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, oil paint sits on top of a canvas. It is a layer. But with wet paper pulp, the color and the water become one single entity. The article describes the effect as scintillating and watery, as close as you could get to actually plunging into the pool yourself.
That is incredible.
He physically replicated the integration of light and water by using water and wet paper.
That goes right back to his dad stripping down the bicycles in Bradford. Like, what is the most functional material I can use to achieve this specific physical effect?
Exactly.
But then he makes an even bigger leap. He swaps paints for pixels. In his later years, he starts drawing on his phone, and then he moves to an iPad.
And he didn't just dabble with the iPad as a hobby either. In 2012, he took over the Royal Academy in London, covering 4 massive walls with iPad paintings of one single bend of a lane in East Yorkshire.
4 walls for 1 lane.
Yeah, he painted that exact same spot on every single day of the year, capturing every subtle shift in the light and the seasons. And then, just before the COVID-19 pandemic struck, he moved to Normandy.
Right. He spends the lockdown in France, tracking the arrival of spring on his iPad. He creates this massive digital gallery, which the article calls a cathedral of green.
It's a great description.
The scope of it has been compared to Monet's L'Orangerie in Paris. You know, those famous immersive oval rooms filled with giant water lily paintings, or even the Bayeux Tapestry, which is that 70-meter-long medieval embroidery that tells a massive continuous story. Hockney himself described this digital work as a long walk through a whole life.
What's so striking about his digital work is the absolute lack of hierarchy in how he views technology. If you're listening to this and wondering why painting on an iPad isn't just some modern gimmick, you really have to look at the mechanics of it.
Okay, let's break that down.
Well, traditional paint requires mixing, drying time, and setup. There is a lag between seeing something and capturing it, but the iPad allows for instantaneous mark making.
Which is huge for capturing light.
Exactly. Furthermore, an iPad screen emits light. It is backlit, much like stained glass or the actual sun reflecting off a pool. Hockney treats the iPad with the exact same reverence as traditional oil paints, because to him, it closes the gap between the eye and the hand.
Wow.
Whether it's a 5-pound pencil sketch of a skeleton, wet paper mache, or glowing pixels on a screen, it's all just another way of making marks and seeing the world. The medium is completely secondary to the act of looking.
So what does this all mean? To me, it shatters the assumption that older artists inevitably become stagnant or stuck in their ways. It's like a legendary acoustic folk musician in their 80s suddenly dropping a groundbreaking electronic dance album that completely reinvents the genre.
That's a great comparison.
It requires a level of humility and curiosity that most people frankly lose as they age. He never lost the curiosity of that 18-year-old kid sleeping on the subway to see the museums.
It also requires a certain level of stubborn defiance. He simply doesn't care what anyone else thinks he should be doing.
Which perfectly explains his attitude toward his chain smoking.
Oh, yes.
We have to mention this detail from the article because it's just too funny. He famously justified his chain smoking while painting by pointing out that his heroes, Picasso, Monet, Renoir, Cézanne, all smoked, and none of them died young.
Yeah, a very selective reading of history.
I just want to point out to you, the listener, that this is survivorship bias at its absolute finest. But it is so perfectly Hockney. He finds a logic that suits his process, and he unapologetically sticks to it.
It is, yeah. But it speaks to that same unyielding focus. He liked to take a step back, look at the canvas, and have a cigarette. It was just part of his rhythm of observing.
Exactly. Observation. That is the true through line of this entire journey we've just taken. When you look at David Hockney's legacy, it isn't really about the beautiful swimming pools or the peachy pink jackets, as iconic as they are.
No, it's bigger than that.
It is about an unyielding, almost mathematical curiosity. He is a man who treats a charcoal skeleton, a mound of wet paper, and an Apple iPad with the exact same intellectual weight. It is all in service of answering one single question. How do I capture the world in front of me?
And that leaves us with a fascinating thought to consider as we wrap up today. If Hockney has proven that an artist's greatest tool isn't a specific type of brush or paint, but simply their ability to adapt, reinvent, and look closer at reality, what medium will the Hockneys of tomorrow use to capture our world?
That's a great question.
Right. If pixels and iPads are today's canvas, will the next generation be painting in virtual reality, manipulating artificial intelligence, or using something we can't even conceptualize yet?
Thanks for listening. Follow us for daily insights into world affairs, and don't forget to like, comment, and share.